Good evening, and thanks for joining us for tonight's virtual event. We welcome you. We look forward to an engaging conversation this evening. My name is Lynne Bader, and I'm an executive producer here at WNED PBS, and I produced Discovering New York Suffrage Stories over this last year. We're going to get into a little bit more about the production, and I can answer questions about the production if you have them, but Discovering New York Suffrage Stories is a 30-minute documentary that's going to premiere next Monday, February 1st, so you want to write that down, at 9 p.m. on WNED PBS. It's also going to be available to stream. So if you go to WNED.org/suffrage, you'll be able to stream the entire program as well. But you can go there even right now if you want to, and you can view the trailer. And then there are also on the site right now 3 short films that we've commissioned from women filmmakers. They each take on a different theme, and we were glad to bring that part of the project together. These women filmmakers came up with very creative ideas, and those short films are online and available for viewing right now. The other thing that's on the website is some free educational resources. There are lesson plans for teachers. So if we have any teachers in the crowd, all the way from middle school up through high school, there are 4 lesson plans that are tied to different segments of the television program with downloadable PDFs and things for your students to do. So you want to take advantage of those. There's a whole list of resources. There's a suggested reading list. There's essays by some of our project consultants, one who's with us here this evening, and a lot of things to look at and to think about as we are trying to really broaden the lens on suffrage and tell the story about New York suffragists and get to know that story a little bit better. Let me see. The first thing I want to do is recognize our funders. Okay, so we had a lot of funders for this program, and these kinds of projects are difficult to put together without appropriate funding. So I want to thank that we received some major support for Discovering New York Suffrage Stories by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Endeavor, and by the Susan Howarth Foundation and Key Bank in partnership with First Niagara Foundation, with additional funding from Fred L. Emerson Foundation and Humanities New York. You know, we're gonna get going here in just a minute. We are glad that everyone is beginning to join us. It looks like we have several dozen people logged in right now. And I know that we had a lot of folks sign up for this event. So, you know, we're gonna take a little bit of time before we actually preview the clip to let people come on and get caught up with everything. If you want to ask questions throughout the evening, all you have to do is type your question or your comment in the chat. And I can tell you that we have some folks behind the scenes who are working really hard to make sure that I get those messages so that we can ask those questions during the event this evening. We're going to watch the clip in just a few minutes, but first I want to introduce you to our guests for tonight's discussion. We have with us Dr. Lillian S. Williams, and Dr. Williams is an associate professor and former chair of the Department of African American Studies at the University at Buffalo. Her work focuses on the intersection of race, ethnicity, gender, and social and political organizations, and her many publications include Strangers in the Land of Paradise, the creation of an African American community, Buffalo, New York from 1900 to 1940. She's also the editor of the Records of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, 1895 to 1992. Now, after decades of research, Dr. Williams, you're also writing a biography right now on Mary Burnett Talbert. So we thank you for joining us, and I'm so glad that you were a part of this project. It's been wonderful to learn more about the suffrage story through your eyes and your perspective.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And then joining us as well, we have Dr. Judith Wellman. Now, Dr. Wellman shared her passion for New York State history, women's history, and the 19th century U.S. history as a professor at SUNY Oswego. And today, she is actually the principal investigator for Historical New York Research Associates, focusing on social and community history, women's history, the Underground Railroad, and preserving local historic sites. She's got a lot of exciting things going on that I know she's going to want to tell us about. And among her many publications is The Road to Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the First Women's Rights Convention. So thank you, ladies, so much for joining me. It's going to be a really interesting conversation as we move on. And we want them to come up with questions too, right? This is a different kind of panel discussion. So what we're going to start with first is a clip from Discovering New York Suffrage Stories. It's about 5 or 6 minutes, and I'll set it up for you a little bit. It comes at the point in the program where we've learned about one of our women, Paulina Wright Davis, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about her as the discussion goes on. But this is really at a pivotal moment for Paulina, and then where the suffrage movement goes from there. Aaron is behind the scenes. You can't hear him, you can't see him, but he's the one that's pulling all the strings. So Aaron, go ahead and roll the clip.
The Civil War forced suffragists to shift their focus from voting rights. Many took up the fight to end slavery. After the war, Davis found herself immersed in an issue that split the movement.
During that time in the Reconstruction, we see the suffrage movement fracture. And there's a piece of legislation drafted, which is the 15th Amendment, that grants protection to Black men, but not to women.
Davis sided with those in the movement who wanted to focus on gaining the vote for women.
The speech she gave at an American Equal Rights Association meeting was powerfully and uncomfortably racist. She said things like Black men should not have the right to vote because they're not qualified. White women would make better voters and safer voters than Black men would. I think the legacy of racism that emerged in the 1860s is carried through into the modern suffrage movement, into the 20th century.
African American women had been involved in the movement from the early days. They were suffragists and worked tenaciously to effect change in their communities.
The contributions of women of color have long been missing from the story of the suffrage movement.
One of the most interesting women of the later part of the 19th century was Hester Whitehurst Jeffrey. I think of her as a woman who saw that there needed to be changes made and worked to make those changes.
For women of color like Jeffrey, getting the vote was part of a larger struggle for basic human and civil rights.
One of the biggest differences for Black women as opposed to white women, you see more of a focus from white women on the right to vote. Would exclusive right to vote.
People are talking about it as the women's hour, the women's era. And Black women are caught there. On the one hand, as women, they're being raised up and valued. On the other hand, as people of color, they're facing, along with men, the most horrific period we've ever seen of murders and lynchings and burnings and destruction of African American people.
Black women had to fight to protect their brothers, their husbands, their sons, and indeed themselves. And these women saw access to the ballot as ways to protect themselves.
Hester Jeffrey is one of the women who crossed racial lines and worked with white as well as Black women.
Jeffrey moved to Rochester in 1891, where she became involved with Black women's clubs who were fighting for suffrage and helping people of color in the community.
These clubs were helping young women who were coming to Rochester to look for jobs. The African American people in Rochester at the time were menial workers. They weren't as educated as she was. So she saw a need to lift her people up.
Jeffrey worked closely with the leadership of the national suffrage movement including Susan B. Anthony. The two women developed a close friendship in Rochester, even though they had different views about the role of Black women in the suffrage movement.
One of the things that's really complicated and yet interesting about Anthony, people want to criticize Anthony for her racism.
White women are saying, if we include African American women in an obvious, powerful way in the women's suffrage movement, we won't get any Southern votes in Southern state legislatures, which are white supremacist. And that's true. Many of them, like Anthony, take a stand against an official stance for African American rights.
You do have this division of the races, but Hester Jeffrey continued with her activism, even knowing that Anthony had engaged in some racist behavior. And I think that really is because Hester Jeffrey considered these issues to be so important that she needed to continue to work for them.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So I specifically chose a clip that was going to be something that could get us started with the conversation. Now, the entire program actually covers 4 women, right? And so we were just beginning to learn about one, Hester Jeffrey, and she came along a little bit later in the movement. I want to start with you, Lillian. The Civil War was one of the things that changed the suffrage movement completely. And what did it do to the relationship between Black women and white women, and Black and white men for that matter?
Well, when we look at the Civil War, women had come together, when Black and white men and women had come together surrounding the issues of abolition and the end of slavery. They saw the Civil War as a new revolution, essentially. How can we make America, the Constitution, be effective and survive all of these challenges that were left undone initially? One of which, of course, would have been to first of all, make African Americans citizens, and then secondly of all, to grant men the franchise. The franchise becomes complicated. African Americans argued that men needed the right to vote. Some African American women agreed that men needed the vote immediately. It has a lot to do with the status of African Americans. For example, some people looked at the notion of domesticity and what that meant. For African Americans, the family was not important in the larger context of the surroundings that they faced. They weren't protected in any way, shape, or form. So some thought that the franchise would allow Black men to protect their families. Black women had been abused, justices had ruled against them when they were attacked. So they had essentially no rights. But with the Civil War and the enfranchisement of men, white women allies, some white women allies fell aside from the movement and argued that African Americans should either get the vote simultaneously or women should be prioritized. They use racist tropes, as some of our colleagues mentioned earlier. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton often used stereotypes when addressing issues surrounding African Americans. So there was a major split, but African American women continued to work for suffrage because they understood the significance of it. So they had strategic alliances, even with people who did express racist views regarding African Americans. So they fought. For them, they needed the vote, but they needed the vote to protect their families, their communities. So it meant race, class, and gender were issues that had to be addressed simultaneously.
So I think we're going to get into these issues of race, class, and gender, and specifically class. Judy, I'd like to have you follow up on what Lillian had to say. She mentioned Susan B. Anthony, and I think a lot of the suffrage conversations that have been going on the last year use Susan B. Anthony as an example of a racist in the movement. Talk about her. She was from New York, right from Rochester. Talk about her involvement with friends of hers who were Black.
Susan B. Anthony had a difficult balance to make because she was a person of Quaker background. She was a person who maintained friendships with African Americans all of her life. And yet she was also a very strategic person, absolutely dedicated to doing what she had to do to get suffrage. And what she thought that the movement had to do was pander to white Southerners. So especially in her in the 1869 convention that Lillian just referenced, she and Frederick Douglass go to it, hammer and tongs, no holds barred. There's some people who argue that basically Stanton and Anthony, especially Stanton, is the one who comes out with all these racist stereotypes. She's kind of an equal opportunity racist because she doesn't like Chinese men voting and not Chinese women. She doesn't like Irish men voting, not Irish women, as well as Black and white. So she's talking about educated suffragists trying to get white women voting. But Anthony and Douglass continued to be friends throughout their lives. And in 1895, here's an example of the balance she's trying to create. She asked Frederick Douglass not to come to the National American Woman Suffrage Association in Atlanta in the first week in February. It's the first national suffrage meeting they've had in the South. And she says, please don't come, it's too complicated. And we won't get Southern white votes if you're there. He doesn't go. But 2 weeks later, he attends a women's convention in Washington, D.C. Anthony invites him up onto the stage where she welcomes him on the stage of the convention. He goes home to his house in D.C. And as he's excitedly telling his wife, Helen Pitts, his second wife, who's a white woman, what had happened at the convention, he has a heart attack and dies. So the very last public event that Douglass attended was a women's rights convention. And at the invitation of Douglass's children, Anthony speaks at Douglass's funeral. And she maintains a long and really important friendship with Hester Jeffrey. Jeffrey creates the Susan B. Anthony Club in the AME Zion Church in Rochester. Susan B. Anthony's very last speech was at the invitation of Hester Jeffrey in the Memorial AME Zion Church in Rochester in February 1906. She speaks there, goes home, and a month later, Susan B. Anthony dies. And who does she have speak as one of the people at her funeral but Hester Jeffrey?
Hester Jeffrey, yeah. So it's certainly not as simple as you make it out to be. It's very complicated. And I think issues of race today in some ways are very simple to understand when you break them down, but then overall, it is a very complicated history that we have. And this is just one part of it, an example of, a couple of women and a couple of men who have that. I want to say a couple of things first. Number one, I want to remind people that the entire program is airing next Monday evening on WNED PBS, Discovering New York Suffrage Stories at 9 p.m. So please tune in for that. You'll be glad that you did. And then also, if you do have questions or comments, I want you to put them in the chat. We have someone who's giving me those questions so I can read them. I'm going to do one right now, and then we're going to get into a little bit more about New York State specifically and what was going on here during that time. But Mary Moglia comments, today it's difficult to explain how race, climate, food, education, reform are inextricably linked. Is it too complicated to meld these together? What would they have done without Black suffragist support? So I'm wondering which one of you would like to take that. Today it's difficult to explain how race, climate, food, and education reform are inextricably linked. Is it too complicated to meld these? All of these issues. Back then they had issues as well.
Yeah, it's not too complicated to meld them. We almost have to meld them.
Okay.
I think one of the problems that we as historians share with the general public is we often see race as predominant and as the only thing that's important in any particular event or incident or confrontation. People are made up of many different, it's age, it's class, it's race, it's sex, it's what we're born with or terms of our basic
Right.
gifts in the world. Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're doing now moving forward is to try to see the complications and not to simplify it, because it isn't a simple story. It never has been, and never will be. And we can do so much more if we begin to look at the complexities and at what we share, as well as what makes us different. And we certainly share climate change. We certainly share food issues. Everyone,
Right, exactly. So Lillian, I'm going to come to you because later in the discussion, we were going to talk about intersectionality, but I think maybe now is the time that we can bring up that conversation. That's a term that's being, I don't want to say thrown around, but used quite often. Talk about what intersectionality is, how that phrase came to be, and how we use it in today's issues that we're dealing with.
Well, actually, we can go back to the period that we were discussing earlier with the white and Black suffragists at the time. African-American women at the turn of the 20th century had to deal with lynchings. Black men and women were lynched at that time because they were African-American, and typically they were affluent people. They were working in menial positions, or we saw legislation which would essentially place them back into a position of slavery. So convict leasing, for example, prison reform were issues that affected adversely African-American people. So Black women at the turn of the 20th century were addressing these issues simultaneously. They couldn't separate one aspect of their identity from others and those of their communities. And we see the same thing in the 20th century. Police reform in the 20th century would have been convict leasing reform at the turn of the 20th century. And the anti-lynching campaigns, which people like Mary Burnett Talbert and Ida Wells Barnett led early on. So Barbara Smith's anthology, I think, captures it quite well. All of the women are white, all of the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. And she's referring to those different aspects that we have to address.
I think I cut you off at the beginning of your sentence. Who writes that?
Barbara Smith.
Barbara Smith. Okay, great. So you guys want to write that down if you want to check out her work. All the women are white, all the men are Black, and some of us are brave.
But some of us are brave.
But some of us are brave. Got it. Okay, we do have another comment. Let me go to the board and read that for you. Kevin comments, in the South, Black women still could not vote after the ratification of the 19th Amendment due to Jim Crow laws. Were there similar obstacles to the Black vote in northern states like New York? So we'll take his question, and then I want to go back and talk a little bit more about Hester Jeffrey and then Mary Talbot, who we didn't get to see any of in this clip, but is an important figure in our show. So what was happening in New York State in terms of the right to vote, not the right to vote, access to voting between 1920 and then the Voting Rights Act?
Blacks in New York State had the right to vote. With the migration of Southerners to northern cities like New York, Blacks had opportunities to influence politics. So politicians courted their vote. Initially, we found them being appointed, Blacks that is, being appointed to the Board of Education or to police departments, to library boards, etc. And when their numbers grew, they were able to use electoral politics to actually elect African Americans. Adam Clayton Powell, for example, was one of those persons. And then if we, well, it goes beyond New York State, but if you look at Illinois, for example, by 1901, there was no Black representation in Congress. So in 1928, we began to see once more African Americans, as a result of migrating to places like Chicago, were able to elect congressional representatives. And those representatives found themselves in a position of representing, quote unquote, all Blacks throughout the country, because they were, others just didn't have representation at that level. But at the state and local level, we did begin to see political influence.
So in New York, which was really sort of a hotbed of reform early on, even before the movement, Judy, we talked a little bit earlier about Quakers, right? Can you expand a little bit more on the role of Quakers in the movement and their relationship with Black people at the time?
There was a group of Quakers in the Rochester area, actually all of Western New York and Canada too, it was transnational, who somehow became extremely radical in our terms and became a force for Seneca Indian land rights, allies with African Americans, and also women's rights people. They were really the movers and shakers behind the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention, for example. There would not have been a women's rights convention without Quakers, and they were so radical that they basically separated from the general Quaker group, who found them very uncomfortable to be around. And they formed a group called the Congregational Friends at Farmington, New York in 1848. And that group of Congregational Friends became the prototype for the American Equal Rights Association in the 1860s, which advocated universal suffrage, which included women and men of all classes and all races. And it was that coalition that split apart in 1869 over the 15th Amendment. But I think they've been kind of lost because we haven't really brought them forward about their national impact. And they continue to be important as ways of influences on people in the suffrage movement and in the Black movement. And people like Frederick Douglass were part of that. So was Susan B. Anthony. And Douglass, the rest of his life, advocated women's suffrage. And Anthony, 1903, she's at a meeting in Rochester for Black suffrage. And so they continued that imprint, if you will, of the period of the 1830s and 40s.
So you talk about parts of history being lost. And I think that was really one of the goals of doing this program, was to help introduce the public to women that were involved in the movement and sort of what their motivations were, what their inspiration was. And very quickly, before we move into the 1880s and 90s, we did talk a little bit about the first Women's Rights Convention, and it was held at the Wesleyan Chapel, and Frederick Douglass was there.
Yeah.
So, but what we don't see, or what we don't have, is a record of Black people attending that convention.
Right. We have about 300 people went to the convention. We know that because the church was so full, people couldn't find seats.
Okay.
But only 100 people signed the Declaration of Sentiments. So those are the names we have. Frederick Douglass is the only known African American who signed that Declaration of Sentiments. But I was thinking about this. The Wesleyan Chapel was formed deliberately breaking away from regular Methodists because they were anti-slavery. And the congregation of the Seneca Falls Wesleyan Church included several African Americans, two of whom, Joshua Wright and Thomas James, were actually trustees of that church. And I find it difficult to imagine that they weren't in the audience. Frederick Douglass, everyone's hero, is coming, these people are affiliated with this church. They are
Sure.
active abolitionists who go to meetings there all the time. It's the one place in town you can have a reform meeting. I can't imagine they weren't there, but we don't know. They did not sign the declaration, so we don't know for sure.
And that, unfortunately, is one of the tragedies of losing history and the inability to then tell a fuller story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's transition forward a couple of decades. Some time has passed since the 15th Amendment, and we're in about 1890. And we'll talk about Hester Jeffrey briefly, and then I really want to get on to Mary Talbert. But in Rochester and in Buffalo, Hester makes her way to Rochester. And what does she do?
Hester Jeffrey arrives in Rochester in 1891, and I think she and Anthony both, and Douglas, are an interesting example of the importance of understanding place in order to understand the choices that people make. I do just sense there's a different kind of relationship here. Not that it's certainly racist. Everybody is. We all are. It's systemic, but there is somehow a different kind of atmosphere. So Hester Jeffrey, for example, she's a member of the Memorial AME Zion Church.
Mm-hmm.
She's also a member of the First Unitarian Church, which is a hotbed of mostly white abolitionists. She works as an organizer, national organizer for the National Association of Colored Women from 1898 to 1902. She goes to the convention in St. Louis in 1904, and she seconds a very strong suffrage resolution that national Black women's group takes in 1904. And then she goes home and she organizes the Susan B. Anthony Club, and she speaks to white women's groups in Rochester beginning in 1899, and she invites Anthony to speak to Black women and men's groups, which she does also. So I think one of the areas that, again, could be a cutting edge research for people is to look at the impact of a local area, especially in places like upstate New York, like Rochester or Utica or Syracuse or Buffalo, because as we were saying before, the situation is more complicated and really more interesting.
Yeah. So Lillian, what I'll do is transfer it to you. We've talked a few times now about race, class, and gender. So let's focus on the middle one. Let's focus on class, because that actually had a lot to do with what ability you had as a Black woman, right, to even be an activist and to lead others. Mary Talbert. Let's talk about Mary Burnett Talbert.
Well, first of all, class is complicated, and Mary Talbot is unusual in terms of any reformer at the turn of the 20th century, Black or white. First of all, Talbot was born to parents who were freeborn and entrepreneurs. They were very affluent, and she married into a very affluent family in Buffalo. So she had those resources. Mary Talbot was born in Oberlin, Ohio. Oberlin was a seat of abolition. In fact, her father had actually purchased land in Oberlin prior to the Civil War because he wanted to move his family there so that they could attend Oberlin College and the schools in Oberlin, which were admitting African Americans on a non-discriminatory basis from the very beginning. But he postponed that move until after the Civil War. But he came to Oberlin. He worked as a barber, very lucrative profession for African Americans, and he was very active in Republican politics. So Mary went to Oberlin High School, went to Oberlin College, graduated from Oberlin College at age 19.
Wow.
Then she went to Arkansas, Little Rock, where she was a teacher. She taught Latin, English, social studies, math, everything one can think of she taught. but she also was active in that community too. She became an administrator, ultimately a principal. She was active in the Eastern Stars, another benevolent organization that signified one's middle class, upper middle class status. And then she married into the Talbot family in Buffalo, a family that had been in this area for roughly 100 years at that point.
Wow.
Peyton Harris was very affluent, owned a third of Grand Island, and owned several shipping lines. So that was the status of Mary Talbot. But in that position, as a teacher, and I now say when she moved to Buffalo and married, she became a former teacher, because at that time married women could not continue to teach in the school system. So she took all of those skills and basically transferred them to working in her community. It was a part of what she had learned in her family, the Congregational church that she had grown up in, and the whole notion for that class to whom more is given, more is required. So she carried out that mandate, creating Sunday school classes, literary clubs, political organizations. She was a founder of the Phyllis Weekly Club, which took on all of these issues, discrimination that African Americans as a group experience, and certainly those issues that impacted women. She later became very involved in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and became a president. And then she went on to do other advocacy work in the national and international forums. I can talk more about those if you have specific questions.
Sure. I do want to say that both of you have fans and friends in the audience who are watching this evening. I just got a note, quick hello from James Ponzo. Hello to my mentor, Dr. Lillian Williams, and my friend, Dr. Judith Wellman. So James, I'm glad you're with us. Thank you so much for joining. You know, just a moment ago, Aaron had a still up of the Phyllis Wheatley Club. Aaron, I'm going to ask you to put that one back up again very quickly, because I want to point out for our folks who are watching where Mary is. Mary's in the back row. Mary Talbert's in the back row, the fourth from the left. And it looks like they're standing in front of a staircase. What that actually is the outside, the exterior of the Michigan Street Baptist Church. And so we have another photograph that we took of the Michigan Street Baptist Church earlier this year. And it looks like they did some reconstruction of the front door where the steps originally were. But that church is still standing. And, you know, you talked about the AME Zion Church, Dr. Wellman, in terms of Hester Jeffrey. Churches were the gathering place for Black people and families. It was where they found their sense of community and where they were really very active in terms of suffrage. And so how did Mary Talbot use the Michigan Street Baptist Church to spread the message of suffrage? We'll start with Lillian.
That was her base. The church was really her base of operation. The organizations that I mentioned before were there. With the Culture Congress, a literary society, she brought in suffragists to address those audiences. Also, people like W.E.B. Du Bois came to Buffalo. Mary Church Terrell, another prominent African-American suffragist. So the church was the site, but there was a convention held in 1910. Well, I guess I should go to starting back 1901. First of all, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs held its convention in Buffalo. So that brought together suffragists across the country and gave a forum for African Americans, women, that is, to be on the national and international stage. That was important. And in 1910, the Empire State Federation of Women's Clubs held a suffrage meeting at the Michigan Street Baptist Church and invited white suffragists to join them. So she constantly used that church as a platform. She lived next door to the church, so it was really convenient. She was the organist for the church. She was the secretary for the church. She was in that church.
all the time. She actually lived just a couple of houses down from that church, right? That's where her house is. Judy, we're going to bring up another image that I just want to have and then have you comment on it. So at this point in the movement, we have Black women and white women trying to heal from the 15th Amendment and trying to come back together. And a lot of that work was done by African-American women, Black women like Hester Jeffrey, who was friends with Susan B. Anthony. But that fact was actually used against her and against Anthony in Southern states. So New York may have been better. We weren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, right? I mean, discrimination still occurred here in New York. It was not perfect here. But in the South, if we want to bring up that still of the suffragist poster of the three women on it, Aaron, I just want to draw your attention to that. So it may be a little bit hard to see on your screens, folks. And if it is, I apologize. But this was a propaganda poster, right, Judy? And how were these used?
One of the things in Tennessee, the very last state that suffragists hoped and had to get if the 19th Amendment was to pass. It's a southern state. It was a hot August day. And anti-suffragists were there in huge numbers and suffragists were there in huge numbers. And one of the things the anti-suffragists did to try to entice votes from the Tennessee legislators, besides having a room in a hotel that was stocked with all kinds of liquor at 24/7, was to create a room in the hotel. They called it a museum, and they put in the museum things like Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Women's Bible to show how terrible the suffragists were about religion. And they also put in photographs of Black friends of Susan B. Anthony saying, like Hester Jeffrey and Frederick Douglass, saying, look, this is what you're in for if you vote for suffrage. So it became an anti-suffragist rallying cry.
Right. Go ahead.
Could I put in a plug for the Michigan Street Baptist Church as one of many sites in New York State that are on the National Votes for Women Trail, which is sponsored by the National Collaborative of Women's History Sites, but the Pomeroy Foundation out of Syracuse is also erecting 250 markers to honor the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment across the country. New York State has about 60 some of those, some for the 2017 New York State approval of suffrage and some for the 2020 approval. And it's way more than any other state in the country. And about a third of them are people of color, including Black women, or several of them are working class women too. There was a strong alliance between Black women in Buffalo and in Brooklyn. So we've got a lot of sites in the downstate area, the crisis offices, the National Association of Colored People published the crisis and came out strongly for women's suffrage. And Sarah Smith Garnett and Maritza Lyons lived in Brooklyn, and we've got a YMCA there where they met. It's just a fascinating and wonderful project. So as people travel around New York State this summer, I want you to keep your eyes open. You can go to www.nvwt.org and find 2020 plus names of suffragists who have sites identified, but also you can find where the markers are.
All right, so I'm gonna have you give that website one more time real slow so everybody hears it. What is it again?
It's www.nvwt.org for National Votes for Women Trail.
National Votes for Women Trail. I mean, I think that what a great trip, to take your sister on, or your best friend, your best girlfriend, head out across the state of New York and visit these particular sites. We shot this documentary during COVID, and that was really interesting. Now, luckily, I was able to just head over to the Michigan Street Baptist Church and interview Lillian. She was very close, right? We just met you there, and it was easy peasy. But then we had to come to Central New York to interview you, Judy, and it was, it is fascinating when you are physically in those spaces. I can't stress enough what experiencing history in the places where it happened does to a person. So I would check out that site and, start planning a safe trip as we're starting to get out and about and certainly do things, right? Okay, so I think the other thing that I wanted to talk about is I want to talk about how women's clubs, Black women's clubs, Lillian, were fighting for more than suffrage, and what was the relationship at that time between Black women's clubs and white women who were continuing the fight for suffrage? Was it a friendly relationship all the time? And what challenges did they have?
Well, in terms of Mary Talbert's activism, one of the important fights that she undertook involved lynching. In fact, it was a continuation really of a fight that had been started by Ida B. Wells during the 1890s, and failed to get Congress to enact legislation. So Talbert, at this time, Talbot was on the board of directors of the NAACP, as were many other club women and former presidents, as we'll see when we look at that organization. So Talbert took her quest for the anti-lynching campaign across the country. She lectured extensively. She brought together Black and white women, and she believed 1 million women could get together and turn the world right side up. And,
right side up, yeah.
So she continued to work with some of those individuals. She also was involved in establishing chapters of the NAACP. And it was so important for that organization at that time to address some of these issues. She would go to places like Arkansas or Texas or Louisiana, places where Blacks had really experienced unprecedented violence. But under the guise of club women, Mary Talbot was able to access these venues and do the work that she was conducting, because most individuals saw these club women as, middle or upper class women engaging in frivolous things such as teas. And they wore white hats, white gloves and fancy hats. So they couldn't be doing anything seriously. As some colleagues will say, those teas were extremely important.
Yeah, they were.
Fights of reform for African-American women. So they were able to connect on that level. And in the North particularly, they did have allies, people like Jane Addams and others, for example, that worked with them. So there were interracial alliances that continued, but African-American women's clubs knew that that was the nature of the struggle. And they took this struggle internationally too. Mary Talbot was representative, in fact, the first formal representative to attend the International Council of Women's Conference, which was held in Norway. And she addressed issues of racism and colonialism there, but she also emphasized the rights of children, and she was highly successful doing that. So she reached out continuously. African-American women, club women, focus upon race, class, and gender across border lines. They were concerned again about the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and drew together women from all of those continents and various countries within them to address systemic racism and how it impacted each of their lives. They founded the International Council of Women of the Darker Races, for example, which is just extraordinary.
It makes me think about how, and we mentioned this in the show, that I think Dr. Susan Goodyear says it in the program, it would have been a luxury for Black women to just be able to focus on suffrage. Clearly, they had, they were being hit from all sides in terms of protecting their families and themselves as a people. So white women had, they had chipped away at protections as well. You mentioned earlier, married women couldn't be teachers. I thought, are you kidding me? But married women couldn't be teachers. Married women couldn't own property in New York State for a very long time. One of our women that we talk about, Paulina Wright Davis, actually fought for a full decade before they were able to enact a law in New York State where married women could own property. And I think that as I think about the relationships of these women with each other, I think about the women's marches of today. I think about the fact that 101 years ago, we passed the 19th Amendment. We ratified the 19th Amendment. And just last week, we swore in a Black female vice president, right? That those kinds of successes, I think, are worth celebrating as a group of women, right? No matter what our color is, right? But I don't want to lose sight of where we're at today and what we still have to achieve. Did these women sit on their laurels and feel like, okay, we're done? Or did they continue to fight? And what, in your minds, what do we face as women today in the next 10, 20 years? What can we learn from the women that we learned about in this program? It's a lot of questions there, I know, but what can we take from the women that we learned about in this program?
One of the things, I'm not sure I learned it from the women in the program, except I do try to listen to people in the past as well as in the present, but just listening is really an important skill that we all need to cultivate. We need to hear each other. And I think a second thing we all need to do is organize. No one's going to do this alone. We need to be allies with each other, and we need to organize. And if we can organize locally and give feedback that filters directly up to Congress, for example, call your congressman all the time. Let him know what you're thinking, because it does make a difference.
Or her.
Yes, I'm thinking of my particular one.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Really responded to, I think, some phone calls.
Okay.
And the other thing, this is my personal commitment, is try whenever you can to organize and listen to people who are different from you. In upstate rural New York, it's my Trump neighbors. But it's also at a larger level, for me as a white woman, to work in groups with Black women. Thank you, Lillian. We've done a lot of work together, and I'm so grateful, because I listen. I need to learn. And I think if all of us kind of made a commitment, we look around and you say, why is this group only white? And invite somebody. It's time we just got over this and moved forward, and we need to do it together, because we can't do it alone.
Lillian, how about you?
I basically concur with what Judy has said. But if we look at the history of club women, it's there. They educated themselves. In fact, I referred to the International Council of Women of the Darker Races and the different nationalities and races that they brought together. Those women understood what Judy just said, that we needed to understand each other. We needed to communicate with each other. So they began by studying each other's languages and cultures. They created syllabi. In fact, Mary Talbert chaired the education committee. So step one is, look, we have the same issues, we understand them, but in order to facilitate our ability to affect change, we need to learn more about each other and those issues. So working tenaciously to get the work done step by step. We can't take a giant leap forward, but we have to do it step by step to make sure that all bases are covered.
And we really do, I think, have to listen across the country to different women and their viewpoints to try to understand how we can address these issues together, right? As one unified group, and respecting each other's different challenges as we move forward, right? So one of the things that I did want to focus on, we've only got a few minutes left, about 5 minutes left, is the program also covers two other women. So we have Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and we have Paulina Wright Davis. So I want to focus on Matilda just for a second. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, she actually gave her first speech in 1852 in Syracuse at a women's rights convention. She was 26 years old. She had 3 young children at the time. And she came to that convention and she gave what people are now calling an amazing speech. It was printed. And then she went on to work with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and certainly other suffragists in New York. But she, lived her adult life in Fayetteville. So folks, that's not a far drive from Buffalo. I mean, it's a beautiful couple-hour drive to get to central New York and see some of the places where all of this began. But, Gage befriended, and many suffragists did, the Haudenosaunee women. So again, a minority group of women had a huge influence on her thinking about women's rights in general. And there are other marginalized groups that we don't pay enough attention to in the history. Judy, I'm going to have you comment on that a little bit, and then Lillian, you as well. How valuable that was that we have somebody like Matilda as part of this story.
Oh, yes. One of the things I've been working on this National Votes for Women Trail, partly because I learned so much, and I have learned so much about suffragists I never heard of. Have you heard of Mabel Pinghua Lee? She was a Chinese American suffragist in New York City, and she rode a horse at the head of a parade in New York City, a suffrage parade, at a time when she, even after 1920, could not herself vote. And she was affiliated with the Chinese church in what's now Chinatown. And there were a lot of Native women who were also active suffragists, even though Native people were not legally voters or citizens until 1924. And some people, like traditional Haudenosaunee people, chose not to be citizens of the United States because they were citizens of their own Onondaga or Seneca people as well. And it's part of why the story, as you look at it, even just scratch a little bit below the surface, becomes a whole lot more complicated and a whole lot more interesting.
A whole lot more interesting. Because it's interesting to talk to people as we were researching this story, and we would talk to women about what they learned in school. And we would say, it was that paragraph in your history book. And every woman would say to me, if that, if that. Like this, I think because of the 100th anniversary celebration, and there's more talk about it, and we are finding more women in public office, it's now come to the forefront. The goal is to keep it here, right? To keep these conversations going. I have a couple of comments from folks who are watching. Catherine Bell Sood says, I'm certainly listening. Learning is the key. Those that forget history have the misfortune of repeating it, or can learn to make positive change more sustained. And then someone else commented and asked about the streaming and the educational materials. So if you go to WNED.org/suffrage, those materials are there. Those lesson plans are there. They're all tied to the program. And really, this is what we do in public media. This is what public media is all about. It's been an absolute thrill and an honor to produce a half-an-hour documentary, but it's an even bigger honor to be able to take something like this program beyond the broadcast and to be able to share filmmaker videos with you, and to be able to have these lesson plans, and to be able to have discussions like the one that we are having tonight. I'm so glad that everyone has joined us. We've had a great turnout, and I think a wonderful conversation. I do want to make sure that we hit everything that you guys wanted to hit. So I'm going to take it back to both you, Lillian, and Judy, for some final comments. I guess we'll start with Lillian.
Well, basically, I think it's important for us to study women's activism. And at one point, we defined what constitutes political activities, and a study of women of color especially showed that the traditional views that historians had written about just don't hold. We have to broaden our definitions and continue to forge coalitions so that we can continue to learn from each other. dig into those sources that typically weren't accepted as sources for understanding people's beliefs and value systems. And we can tell a more complete story and indeed affect change.
Absolutely. Judy?
I think listening and learning is so key. Listening, I don't know how else we do it. And then organizing as allies, as Lillian said. We can't do it alone. We need to do it together, but we need to do it because we have some understanding of each other. I love the word respect. It seems so key to this. And I'd like to suggest for people who want to follow more, a couple of recent books by Kathleen Cahill, Recasting the Vote, how women of color transformed the suffrage movement. And Martha Jones also has a wonderful new book on African-American women as suffragists.
So I think that both of those books, along with a host of others, your books, ladies, are on the site. We have a suggested reading list if you want to dig into this a little bit more. I can't thank you both enough for joining this evening. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm glad you let me spend this time with you both.
And you too, Lynn. Thank you so much for doing this. And we have to remind people it's a lot of fun too. So enjoy.
Absolutely. Okay, so I want to remind you all before we go, Discovering New York Suffrage Stories airs on WNED PBS next Monday evening, February 1st at 9:00 p.m. The program will also be available to stream at that point. All of the resources are available on the website on WNED.org/suffrage. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our funders one more time for allowing us the resources that we needed to do this project. Major support for Discovering New York Suffrage Stories was provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Condition, or Human Endeavor rather, and by the Susan Howarth Foundation and Key Bank in partnership with First Niagara Foundation, with additional funding from Fred L. Emerson Foundation and Humanities New York. Again, tune in Monday night, go to the website, put it in your favorites, visit it often. I want to have you all be safe and be well. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.